So this actually is a good segue, because one of the things that's been said here and that's been suggested here, and it's something that I hear conservatives say all the time, and even more moderate liberals, is that it was great when it started with just trying to push for more acceptance of alternative sexual lifestyles, but now it's just gotten to the point where we've tumbled down the slippery slope and we've begun to openly embrace and accept pedophilia within our institutions, even if we're not openly saying that clearly in terms of the actions that we're allowing and even pressuring people to take. Pedophilia is something that we as a culture have begun embracing. There is some truth to that, but the reality is much darker, which is that the intellectual movement that led to the sexual revolution was always intentionally set up with the express purpose of normalizing things like pedophilia, incest, and bestiality. And so when you look at images like the one we have here, which is being shown to children in schools in a book called Genderqueer, it's basically non-binary fetish porn. People see that, they'll show it to school boards, and the school board will say, you can't show this to us, it's too disgusting, even though they're letting and even forcing minors to look at this content in schools. And we look at this and go, where did this kind of content come from? And there are a few different places, but there's one figure I want to focus on today. His name was Alfred Kinsey, and Alfred Kinsey is known as the godfather of the sexual revolution. That's how the New York Times referred to him. This is the founder, the intellectual founder of what we refer to today as sexology. Kinsey was to sexology what Freud was to psychology, what Newton was to classical physics. This is the person who laid out the methodology and intellectual framework for this, and also for the sexual revolution overall. Alfred Kinsey's work was not merely pseudoscientific, it was unabashedly, openly pedophilia, openly pedophilic, and had details in the research that was obtained through the sexual abuse of children. So what I'm about to show you is a clip. It's 1 minute and 30 seconds long. This was on the Phil Donahue show back in 1990. So if you think any of this is new, or any of this pro-pedophilia acceptance stuff is recent or just cropped up in the last few years, check this clip out of Judith Reisman arguing with people from the Kinsey Institute about his research and the fact that children were abused so that he could obtain it.
And I'd like to see your resume as well.
To see it.
The tables showed the number of orgasms in humans, males, I assume, 5 months to 4 years.
You've got 2 months old.
5 months.
Okay. You've got one child allegedly having a climax. Where are those tables? So you've got 24 hours around the clock, 26 orgasms in a 4-year-old. You want to tell me? You want to tell me where are those tables?
Show them, Brian.
Where are the tables?
Yeah. Well, we're going to show them.
There.
Now,
All right, read
now, what is the point?
You
what is
tell
your
me
point?
what is the point. You know what Dr. Gebhardt
say?
He wrote me a letter, which I wish you had up there too, in which he said that oral and manual techniques were used on the children. Now, Phil, I'm going to say that once more. I'm going to say that once more. And if I'm wrong, let them sue me. He said oral and manual techniques were used on those children.
Yeah,
what American is going to defend that?
How does C.A. Tripp respond to that?
She's talking about data that came from pedophiles, that he would listen to only pedophiles who were very careful, used stopwatches, knew how to record their things, did careful surveys, and these she resents very much, but they're very important.
So he interviewed people who were known criminals, I assume. Were they in prison at the time?
Oh, certainly not, but they were, in her sense, criminals because they were pedophiles, but they were trained
Oh, in her sense,
observers.
they were criminals because they were pedophiles. They're raping children and they're not criminals. You're going to defend
Nobody
that.
was raping children. What they
what
were
do you
doing...
call sexually, manually, and orally abusing a baby, and you're a bloody pedophile?
And as for...
A bloody pervert.
Because he was Kinsey's photographer. He was one of Kinsey's colleagues, and he worked with him throughout his career, and he's defending this behavior, saying these were trained men with stopwatches doing this, so it's okay, denying that it's criminal or wrong for these children to have been abused. And Donahue's sitting there basically agreeing with it, and other people on stage are agreeing too, that this was totally acceptable and totally normal behavior. Now, what Kinsey did with his research, aside from being complicit in the sexual abuse of children, is he advocated for pedophilia. In his work, The Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, he said that it is more traumatic to a child who has been sexually abused when the parents overreact to it. And it's the adults getting upset that actually causes the problems, and not the fact that they were molested or sexually abused or raped. And so his institute has always defended this. He was very openly in favor of this, and part of the reason he's known as the godfather of the sexual revolution is because what his work did is it painted a picture of how human beings behaved in what we would now refer to as a more puritanical time. So he did this study on human sexuality, which was a survey, and he was talking to people in the 1940s and asking them about their sexual behavior. And the conclusion he drew and what he published in his work was, we have all of these taboos, but no one listens to them anyway. So let's stop having these taboos, and also let's make our penal codes for sexual abusers less strict. And that did end up happening. Our penal codes were modified, many forms of sexual conduct were legalized, and penalties were lessened for other forms that remained illegal. But the reason he was able to make this claim is because he went around interviewing people who were in prison as sex offenders, prostitutes, homosexuals, other people who were living outside of the status quo of that era, and he didn't tell people that he was oversampling these groups when he published his work. Right. So it created the impression that everyone was doing perverted things already. For example, his work said 50% of men cheat on their wives, 25% of women cheat on their husbands, as many as 50% of farm boys living on farms commit bestiality with animals, completely disgusting nonsense, and people ended up buying into it and believing it. And so we have a clip here of one of Kinsey's colleagues, this photographer, describing what Kinsey had to say about pedophilia. And this is not an enemy of Kinsey. This is one of his friends who's celebrating what he's saying here.
Okay.
Kinsey said some of the most brilliant things imaginable about that. Pedophilia is an almost non-existent kind of crime, and the thing that he hated most about it is that people use words like child molestation. What is that? Nobody knows. Abuse of children, are they talking about bollocks them against the ear or hitting them with a stovepipe? Are they talking about tickling them a little? Are you talking about fondling? You're going to put fondling and death attacks in the same group? As Kinsey said, by this kind of paranoia, you do the child more damage for life than all the pedophiles in the world would do.
It looks like
that freak. Look at that
standard pedophile.
Disgusting
It seems like they're trying to normalize it, and it also seems like what you're saying is that white lab coat theory is like, well, this guy's a doctor, so we got to trust his research. No, doctors are wrong a lot of the times. There's whole lawsuits against them often.
You are absolutely right, and part of the reason Kinsey was so successful is because we were just coming out of the Second World War, and our vision of the world was scientists helped us win this war
Trust
with
the
the bomb. And it was the science. So if you were wearing a lab coat, people worshipped you. This goes so much deeper than Kinsey, because after he ended up publishing his work and defining this entire field, his co-authors and people who worked with him and his disciples ended up defining the entire field of modern sex education. Whenever you hear the phrase comprehensive sex education, what they're saying is Kinseyite education, education that is based on the assumptions Kinsey made. Here we have one of Kinsey's co-authors, Wardell Pomeroy, quoted in Time magazine saying that incest between adults and children, right there in print, in his words, is beneficial. And we have to do away with the idea that it isn't. Wardell Pomeroy is interesting because he was one of the founding board members of SECUS, which still exists to this day, and which still outlines standards for comprehensive sex education in the United States of America. You have other institutions that are fortunately defunct, like the Society for Scientific Study of Sex. One of the presidents at one point was Vern Bulow, who was on the board of a Nordic pro-pedophilia journal. There's so many different, and he was given an award by the Kinsey Institute. Wow. So many of these people, again, were openly in favor of pedophilia. These were not fringe figures. These are the heroes of the field who have totally defined the methodology that's used to study human sexuality. And one disturbing example is the sexual attitude reassignment seminars that people who are sexologists as their primary field of study have to attend. And what they essentially do at these seminars is they have you watch hours and hours of pornographic content to make you more comfortable with various perverse behaviors so that you can affirm patients who engage in those kinds of lifestyles. And this is, of course, all based on Kinsey's teachings, based on Kinsey's quote-unquote non-judgmental approach to examining these issues. And I just want to ask the question, while it is, of course, important for people who study human sexuality to be aware of the existence of the various perversions that exist so they can treat them, it is not their job, it is not their duty, and it doesn't make sense for their field to have them study it in a way that biases them in favor of those issues. You would not have nutritionists watch hours and hours of people smoking cigarettes and eating McDonald's so that they could become more comfortable with those behaviors and counsel people who are living with horrible lifestyles with respect to their health and say what you're doing is fine, and I'm going to be non-judgmental and not push you in any other direction here. But that's effectively what we have done with sexology.
Well, in my stand-up, I talk about all the letters they've added: LGBTQIAA, and then there's a plus sign. So I go into like, what's coming next? But someone came up to me and they go, you know what's coming next is P.
Yeah,
they want to make P, so they want to leave that open. I was like, that kind of blew my mind. Like, oh no, that's not good.
They keep trying to relabel the word already. Like they was spoken on the podcast
Yeah,
the other
first
day.
person.
Yeah, first person, or like I've heard a bunch of things like that, especially in California.
Minor attractive.
Yeah, there you go.
person.
That
Right,
works.
yes, yeah. They always try to make the language less ugly. In fact, you can even argue that the phrase that we use now, pedophile, doesn't go far enough. They used to call them pederasts, right? Pedophile, philia, that means love. There's nothing loving about what these people are doing. They're disgusting perverts who harm children. And as mentioned earlier, all of this, every single step we've taken down the slippery slope was intentionally laid out, and our course was charted so that pedophilia could be normalized. And there's one thing I'd like to point out here about pornography and pornographic content, and how disturbing it is not only that sexologists are required to watch hours and hours of pornography at these seminars, but the fact that this same kind of exposure therapy has been happening to the American public for decades because of porn legalization. And one bit of information that Kinsey learned, which has not been repeated by any of our institutions or establishments or any of the people who claim that he's a hero. And I have a clip right here of his cameraman once again revealing a shocking truth about Kinsey that I think is very instructive.
When Kinsey first hired me to do pictures, he said, I want to warn you of something. As soon as we get you to photographing sex every day and paying attention to sex, right, left, and center, pretty soon nothing will turn you on. Nothing in the area, nothing visual will turn you on. Because you'll lose all those sensitivities.
Basically, what he says there, what his cameraman is saying there, that's a man who Kinsey hired to make pornography for him. And he was calling it research, of course, but he was having him film pornographic content. And what he said to this photographer, this filmmaker, was, once you start doing this, and once you see this amount of sexual activity, nothing visual will be able to arouse you again.
Yeah.
You're going to be totally desensitized. Now, isn't it fascinating that Kinsey, whose pseudoscientific research and assumptions have been touted out and sold to us as gospel truth, is ignored when he says porn does desensitize people. It does make them more sexually perverted. It does make it more difficult for you to have healthy sexual relationships, just as he warned his cameraman. But that's one little bit of information that they don't tell people, and that's because pornography is a very important mechanism for social control. This is something that Wilhelm Reich said in so many words, that we will not discuss the existence or non-existence of God. We will simply tear down sexual repression, as well as remove the infantile connection between child and parent. They know that if they can erode sexual morals, people will not believe in God, they will not believe in a higher power than the state, they will be obedient serfs who pursue pleasure and see nothing as more important than whatever they are told they need to do to stay in line so they can keep consuming and have their pleasure.
We talk all the time about social media algorithms, but I've heard there's algorithms on porn that after you finish a video, they're starting to suggest the next one up, and it's even more depraved than the last to get you in there, because then the only place you can find that
Who
stuff
makes it to the
is
end?
on.
Yeah.
I've never seen the credits for a movie. You know what? How about the next one? I feel like I beat the porn before.
You beat the game.
Yeah, like the last level.
The only way you beat it is by not watching it.
Yeah.
Seamus, quick question. So who was like the force behind Kinsey? It's like, why do you have so much public support? Was it like a WF type of situation?
That's a great question. The Rockefeller Foundation.
Oh, of course.
Yeah,
All roads
now
lead
we
back
know.
to it.
Yeah.
The
There we go.
Rockefellers.
And of course, all the institutions were supporting what he had to say. There's a part of this which just boils down to human nature. Human beings are willing to believe anything so long as it tells us that we're good people who don't need to improve or do any work on ourselves. And what Kinsey's research essentially said to people who were sexually perverted is, nothing you're doing is that bad, everyone else is already doing it anyway. And to people who weren't sexually perverted, it said, look how good you are because you're not doing these things that everyone else is doing. So it's wishful thinking in a lot of ways, and people were willing to buy into it for that reason, I think.